Welcome to all those tuning in early. Early is on time. We'll be beginning our presentations in a matter of moments, but we thank you for being so punctual and we appreciate your attendance this fine evening on behalf of the Department of Africology and African American Studies. This is actually my pilot's voice. If I was ever blessed enough to learn how to fly a plane, you got to set the people at ease and have a calm tone because typically I'm very excited. But it's what's good, Professor? Someone said, oh yeah, you have access to the chat, so you can engage and interact, and I guess even prepare for potential Q&A moments at the end if time permits. Everything is good. We are on the move, informing, enlightening through an Afrocentric lens. We are transforming the world. It's a beautiful day, a beautiful evening now. But whenever you want me to start, Doc, I'll go ahead and I see we got 2 minutes. And if that's fine, if you want me to start right on time, I'll go ahead and do that. If you want to wait a minute or two, I can accommodate accordingly.
I'm sorry, I was muted.
Oh, no worries.
I don't see Kimani or Michael. Are they here? I don't. We can't tell. So, at any rate, yeah, I think you should start at six. I mean, on time,
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
and then we go with that, and um,
Yeah, and then I can keep everybody's time a little better
yeah. Mhm.
and appreciate the time of those who signed on early, right? No need for them to wait. You shouldn't be punished for being punctual. I just thought of that. I'm gonna keep that one. You shouldn't be punished for being punctual. I know somebody like that's right.
That's right. That's right.
That's right. Let me see who's in here. Okay, that's good. Got 15 people. The star students. That's who's here now. Yeah, I'm gonna give it like 1 more minute, and I'm gonna go ahead and cue up my clock. Make it plain. That's what Malcolm would tell him. That means give a short introduction, right? Make it plain. That's what I plan to do tonight. Oh, that's beautiful. We got slides ready as well. Yes, please make sure your microphones are muted. You cannot be heard by the speakers or moderator. All right, it seems to be 6 o'clock. Welcome, everyone, to Racial Implications of Washington, the insurrection that occurred on January 6th, 2021. Africological analysis. Many voices have been heard on this topic, but I think it's of paramount importance that the Afrocentric analysis be at the forefront in terms of how to engage said phenomena, because we want to make sure that we are not on the margins of European analysis and on the periphery of Eurocentric thought and methodology, but we want to be, subjects and centered in our own historical and cultural narrative, as Dr. Molefi K, Asante often instructs us. So without further ado, I am your host, your facilitator, your moderator, and your friend, Aaron Smith, and I have the distinct privilege and pleasure of working in the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University, where the first doctoral program in African American Studies was created by Dr. Molefi K, Asante. Tonight, we have an all-star lineup for you. We have Dr. Nah Dove. We have the angriest black man in America, attorney Michael Cord. We have Lindsay Gary, Dr. Kimani Nehusi, Michael Wilson, and of course, Dr. Molefi K, Asante. So without further ado or don't, I would like to bring to the microphone Dr. Nah Dove. Each presenter will take about 15 minutes to explain their thoughts and their analysis regarding the situation on January 6th, and I guarantee that you will be blessed, inspired, enlightened, and informed. So take it away, Dr. Nah Dove. Let's make sure your mic isn't muted. And for everyone else, make sure your mic is muted.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for being here. And I'm very honored as an Africologist to represent the department and do my best to give an Africological analysis of this situation. Of course, as an Africologist who studies the phenomena pertaining to Africa, if effectively it means at some point I can study anything and everything because humanity came out of Africa. So everything also pertaining to humanity is my field as an Africologist. And my studies overall have led me to understand, importantly, the cultural construction of race. And although it is a falsehood, it really is a powerful existence living inside the race construct. So it is false, but it is very real to every person on the planet Earth. And about the insurrection, I'll start with saying that an insurrection is a violent uprising against the authority or government. But in the minds of the people who rose up as insurrectors, in the normal sense of the meaning, they tried to take the White House, believing in fact that it was already theirs and that the sitting president, who was Donald Trump, was already there and therefore it was his White House. And he called upon them to try to capture the White House because his votes were stolen and he still was really the president. So they were just trying to support him and take away any transition that would allow any others to take over because Donald Trump was the true president. His votes had been stolen. So they were just trying to protect his position. Now, everything is about race in my mind's eye, and that whole thing was about race. And I explain it because often race is seen as something that you can just have a little discussion about or be polite about or mention a few things. But in reality, it's not something separate from existence. It's rather central to existence, the quality of life, the ability to even have a life, and it even determines the length of life. The construction of race, as we know, places humanity in a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority, largely based on melanin content. Essentially, we have 5 racial types who are considered to be genetically different and biologically different, none of which is true. But we have the white, yellow, red, brown, and black. The darker and more melanated, the less chance to live and have a good life and live to a ripe old age. And the least melanated, the more chance to be held in admiration and to survive well. Now, even in Black countries or African countries, there are still racial hierarchies imposed inside nation states, designed and dominated financially by the conquerors, both the Arabic and European, that are anti-African, anti-Black women, men, and children. In the situation of the insurrection of January the 6th, as I said, it's all about race. And when we look at the construction of race, and that's what we need to look at to understand why they tried to take the capital, they have inside the culture of Europeans, the more recent one, it's been influenced over centuries to believe that African people are less than human, are not human. And in America, the conquest of the indigenous First Nation people, that was, the idea of European culture and the idea of what white supremacy has justified the taking of this land and the blood spilt in the Americas. And the enslavement of African people brought over here has enabled these white supremacists to kill African people and First Nations people here openly. But that killing is global white supremacy has actually taken the lands, stolen the lands from the original people, whoever they were, whether they are yellow, red, brown, or black, through violence and murder. And violence and murder is still a very powerful thing here. People are killed secretly every day here, and it's not part of the law to stop it. It's just part of a law that you can do it because you're a white supremacist, and that is the basis of how you become supreme, through murder and genocide. That's the foundation of this country and the foundation of the thinking of white supremacists. Their teachings have demonized and debased African women, men, and children in the effort, as I've said, to steal these lands. Those who took part in the insurrection were fighting for their traditional rights as white people to openly murder Black people on a daily basis. History and her story will attest to the brutality of the heinous crimes committed against African humanity, brought, and enslaved in the Americas, and prior to that in Western Asia for the last 2,000 years. And it would be wrong to ignore the red people, the first people here. According to the figures of Russell Thornton, 68 million people were murdered by white supremacists in the Americas. So they discuss their powers amongst themselves. Donald Trump, the president, is merely a puppet of puppeteers. And generally, those type of thinkers have no education to understand who they are, why they exist, what they're doing here, and even their own potential. They're not grounded in any reality based on truth. And that is the intention of state-run schools here. And clearly that's the outcome and the evidence of state-run schools and the teachings and lack of knowledge that students receive. They who tried to storm the Capitol believed that the white people inside were actually betraying their cause and being un-American. So they were only trying to enforce what is the central theme to their power base and existence, white supremacy. They were trying to enforce the real world as they see it. They were mostly represented by military types, police, soldiers, and those people who enjoy killing the so-called lower orders or the beasts, and they enjoy that within the law. And their main belief in the murder of non-white, especially Black humanity, is based on the so-called belief in human evolution in the name of progress, whereby beasts will be replaced by the strongest, wisest, smartest, most beautiful of all humanity, who they believe they are. While this progress is considered natural, killing the lower orders, so to speak, or the lower races, their killing of them is part of moving the natural order forwards, the idea of progress. They are helping nature do the natural thing, because these types, these lower types who we represent, will eventually be wiped out because we're the weakest bestial beings on the planet. So it's quite natural to them in their minds to help nature carry out its role. They don't see any kind of problem with that, and that's what they're trained to believe. So this cultural belief is also a policy of behavior in stealing lands, and also ensconced in the laws of this land. And it's ironical to think of the stealing of votes that they had in their minds to bring back the gallows, because that's what they wanted to do, was to kill the people inside there. Now, it seems strange because we often say, oh, white supremacy, all white people are part of white supremacy. Now, in some ways, by allowing it to happen or pretending to be ignorant or whatever, there is that. But there are people who promote it and live by the principles of it, and they will kill their own people who appear to be siding with Black people or supporting them, such as in the Black Lives Matter marches. That was horrific for them. And so, you know, they went to the Kenosha March, the Black Lives Matter march there, and then they murdered two white people there. And, you know, the person who murdered these people, the young white man who murdered these people with the support of the Proud Boys and all those people, he's out on bail right now on $2 million. He's free. So they're not averse to killing white people who betray white supremacy. And interestingly, as Dr. Asante pointed out, that when the votes came in fact, the white people who actually wanted to have a type of government that could bring some kind of more equality or could challenge some of the race thing and make some new types of laws to change things were in the minority. They could only have won. We did win because the Black, the brown, the red and the yellow people, mostly women, voted with them. And that's how we actually got the majority, because if we'd relied on white people, we would have lost. So now we actually have the chance to see if we can move to a more sort of ideal, democratically led way of moving into the future. So am I at the 15 now? Okay. So there are some people, the ones who went to the Capitol tried to kill Mike Pence, who betrayed Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi, and other people in there. All the people that they were in there were all betrayers as far as they were concerned. And so they see them as traitors and betrayers. And so there are all these contradictions, like the White House was built upon the blood of the original people, but still those people inside who are trying to make that change, they saw them as people that needed to die and be hung on the gallows outside. And as an Africologist, from my vantage, I believe that education in the ancient African way of understanding education, which is the key to enlightenment, is the key to knowing who we are, why we're here, and what we may become. And because I'm looking at a cultural orientation rather than a genetic orientation, I'm trying to say that it's possible that human beings can change. If we use race, which is their orientation, then nobody can change. And either way you look at it, if you've got too much white in you, you're the devil. If you're looking at it from a Black perspective, and you've got too much Black in you, you're the devil, looking at it from the white perspective. So either way, nobody can change. We're all biologically and genetically this. Culture enables people to change because it is the root of the behaviors, the thoughts, the beliefs, the actions of humanity. So that is the direction as an Africologist that I'm going in: education, enlightenment. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dr. Nadav. If you're just tuning in. Make sure you get the recording because you already missed some good information. I am Aaron Smith. I work in the Department of Africology and African American Studies, and I am so pleased to be the moderator for this evening on behalf of the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. This is Racial Implications of the Washington Insurrection, January 6th. We have an all-star lineup tonight, but at this time, I just want to keep the momentum and keep the party going, and I'm going all the way to H-Town. Coming down. Shouts out to Miss Lindsay Gary, one of the future major voices in Africology, currently studying at Temple University as a graduate student. Take it away, my sister. You have 15 minutes.
Wow, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you so much, Dr. Asante, for allowing me to share from a graduate student perspective. Before I begin, I would like to pay respects to Dr. James Conyers, one of my mentors, who recently transitioned into ancestorhood, for all of his work and specifically for being a mentor to me and helping me to be able to be a part of this by getting me to Temple through all the help that he gave me at the University of Houston. And so I would not be here without him and with Dr. Asante and my other professors who are here today. So thank you so much. The insurrection on Washington on January 6th is proof that racism and white supremacy not only exist in this country, but thrive. If there was ever any doubt, this attack, one of the most egregious attacks of my lifetime on the government, serves as a clear reminder of the terroristic foundation this nation was built on. A foundation that was built by the very same people who in 2021 are causing it to crumble. When I was reflecting on this incident, I cannot say that I was surprised, being an Africologist and all the studies that I've done. It was actually expected. The great Aimé Césaire wrote that colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to violence, and to race hatred. This attack was supported and encouraged by Donald Trump. It was an attempt to stop the certification of the vote, an attempted coup to prevent the removal of one of white supremacy's strongest advocates, who just so happened to be in the White House. These people were only willing to support democracy as long as they felt that it unabashedly supported white supremacy. And when it didn't, January 6th happened. We as African people are no stranger to this type of attack, because quite frankly, racism is nothing new to us. We experience it every day. But as we know, many, if not the majority of the United States presidents have been racist. They've been white supremacists. From George Washington's enslaving of our people to Woodrow Wilson's support of the Ku Klux Klan, which is eerily reminiscent of Donald Trump's relationship with QAnon. Césaire said that a civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. So the question that I'm asking as a millennial, as a young graduate student in the Department of Africology, becomes, how will the United States solve its problem of racism and white supremacy? A question that we've been asking for hundreds of years. The democracy as we see it now clearly has gaps, some gaps, but really big gaps, as we witnessed together a month ago on January 6th. Gaps that are still lingering even with the new administration. and even after being so-called saved by the Black woman and by the Black vote. So the answer that I'd like us to consider, particularly the people in my generation who wholeheartedly understand that this behavior is not permissible, is how we can look to our African concepts and philosophies to determine the best ways of governance for our true liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, wait, make sure. Okay, you hear me. Thank you so much. You ever see people when they talking on mute and they say something real profound and they think everybody heard them, and then everybody start doing like this. They be like, "You're on mute." But I didn't want to get started. Okay, you can hear me. It's the new normal. Welcome to Zoom country. Okay, if you're just tuning in, on behalf of the Department of Africology and African American Studies, we'd like to thank you for joining us for Racial Implications of the Washington Insurrection on January 6th. This is an Africological analysis. Thank you, my good sister, Lindsay Gary. And now we are going to move on to someone you might be familiar with if you read the book about libations. That is arguably the best, or text on the subject. You might have heard about a people's history of Guyana. You might have just heard him in class at Temple University with an international Africological analysis of all things of importance. This man is going to break it down in 15 minutes because I know how good he is with keeping time. My good brother who sat on my committee. I'm just claiming it. I'm clout chasing. I'm riding the wave right now. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Kimani Nehusi, for being here and for what you're about to present. And prepare yourself, again, to be blessed and enlightened. Take it away, Dr. Kimani Nehusi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. It's a pleasure to be here and sharing on an occasion like this. Let me just call up one or two things and emphasize them really that you've done. One is that this is an Africological analysis. And what that commands us to do is to look at the phenomena we are examining from the point of view of African people, our history, and our culture. Of course, there are other finer articulations of this position, but that's where we're coming from as a generality. And I'm very, very pleased to be able to do this, most especially from a porch in the Department of Africology at Temple University, and in the company of Dr. Asante, Dr. Dove, Lindsay Gary, Jasmine Evans, Michael Wilson, and you, of course, are cheering. One of the first things I believe we should be able to say about this is that there's been a contest to define what happened. First, we heard it was a riot. We also heard that it was a mob assault on the Capitol. We also heard that it was just an attack. Then we've come around, I suspect, most of us, of calling it an insurrection. One of our duties as people of African descent in America today is to define what we see happening around us, especially something as profound as this. And we're called to do this, first of all, from our own perspective. What's our perspective? We could ask ourselves, and we could ask the world to consider this. If a group of African Americans had armed themselves with various implements, including plastic restrainers, call them plastic handcuffs if you want, guns, clubs, and flagpoles, and so on, and launched an attack on the bastion of American democracy, what would America as a generality and the world have called that event? Here's a hint. What do we call the attack on various buildings in America that occurred on 9/11? Is there any difference in how we have sought to define what happened on January the 6th, 2021, and 9/11? And if so, why? We could delve a bit further and invite ourselves to reflect on how we, America, defined a certain other attack upon this union. I'm talking here now about the Civil War. We normally say it was a civil war. We never talk about secession, an armed attack upon this union by members of this union. Again, I invite us to examine how we have historically defined the Confederacy and how we would have defined such a development had a group of African Americans, or for that matter, any other of the other Americans, been the ones to launch that attack. And why is there this difference in how we define it? Let's be clear that America has celebrated in very many statues people who armed themselves and attempted to break away from this union because they had disagreement and they were defeated. Even after they were defeated, many of the Confederate statues went up, mainly in the south of this nation. Why did we allow that? Why did we allow, in other words, a celebration of armed terrorism, of some of the greatest crimes possible in any nation? Why did we not confront it? It's clear to me that the answer is because those people were white. And America has had a certain engagement with whiteness from the inception of this nation. And I'm going to come back to that just now. Now, in that immediate aftermath of this attack, some of our leaders said, that's not who we are. That is not who we are. Now, those people may have been well-meaning, and it is also true that that is not how most of us are. I hope most of us. But clearly, that's not how many of us are. However, it is also true that many of us have been like that. That has been a part of us. From the inception of this nation, that ugliness has been a part of us. And it is high time that we recognize that that has always been an aspect of us. And when I say recognize, I mean admit it publicly and deal with it. Now, it is a fact that the elephant, this elephant in the American house, has always been white supremacy. And it is time we call it out. It is time we discuss it openly. It is ugly, but it is truth, a part of our truth. And if we continue pretending that it is not part of us, then all those great things we tell ourselves about ourselves in the myths and in the narratives we construct about ourselves will always be subverted by this ugliness. we will always be undermined in our claims about democracy, Christianity, freedom loving, all those high sounding things we tell about ourselves. Every time we say that, we will be grossly hypocritical because we have refused constantly from the birth of this nation, and I do mean that, to deal with the fact that we have racism, white supremacy, the evil of racism in our midst, and that it has organized many institutions, almost all institutions, to perpetuate itself to the detriment of many groups, especially African Americans, indigenous Americans, but also to the entire America. Because let's face it, we cannot be the best we could be if significant portions of ourselves are disabled by faulty education, faulty socialization, a system that commits most of us or significant numbers of us to jails, to places where we are not developing to become the best that we could become so that we can contribute to this nation. Now, at various historical moments, eruptions like January the 6th have happened to remind us that we have this festering sore, or this evil within us. But America has refused to deal with it. We have torn our faces from the logical consequences of a large number of things. We could talk about the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We could talk about many, many historical acts. We could talk also about the meaning of civil rights. Have we dealt with this thoroughly? We could mention the overthrow of a democratically elected local government in Wilmington, Virginia, which is another discussion point in recent times. More recently, the murder of George Floyd and many other African Americans. Have we really dealt with the consequences, the logical consequences of all of these? The answer is a screaming no. What does that make us? Have we tried to do these things? So for me, the racial implications of the 6th of January calls out the need, the urgent need to deal with centuries of oppression, to put things right, to make certain that we who boast about being a can-do nation do what we're supposed to do. And let me end by saying this. We as African people see the repair of ourselves, and I deliberately mention reparations here because this is another big issue that needs to be discussed by African people and by the American nation. We see the repair of ourselves as a critical aspect of dealing with racism. And in our department, that's why many of us invest in retrieving our history and trying to learn the lessons of that history and implement them in our daily lives. And I want to join with Dr. Dove here in talking about the way in which African people have been educators. And let me begin at the beginning and say this, that our people were the people who made humanity. We gave humanity to humanity because we were the first human beings. And we became the first human beings because we became the first people to make a society. And it is our distinguishing mark that we initiated a process of adding value to humanity, so that when we came out of the noon, the chaos, the backwardness, and we started to establish Ma'at, that is exactly what we were doing. And that is why the ugliness of the 6th of January and the greater ugliness of the refusal to deal honestly and openly with the implications of the 6th of January offend us, because it offends our humanity. It offends our record of truth and justice and righteousness and all of those other things we mean by Ma'at and by the establishment of society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kimani Nehusi. If you're just tuning in, or if you've been with us from the beginning, thank you all for tuning in today. Racial implications of Washington's insurrection, the Washington insurrection at the Capitol. We're discussing that from an Africological perspective. I'm Aaron Smith, the moderator for this evening's festivities, because it feels, it always feels like a family gathering, which is always good, especially in these times where social distancing, is so prevalent. I'm going to use this moment to look at our Q&A component on behalf of the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. I see one question is for Sister Lindsay's, and it says, excellent, Ms. Gary, but my question is asked by whom, when you're referring to the answer and the question, and referring to the country asking how to solve the issue of race. Thank you, Philip, for that question. And if you can recall what section of your presentation I was referring to, you can feel free to respond now. And make sure you're off mute.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. So you're asking, who's asking the question? Let me see this one more time. I'm muting myself. Who's asking the question of solving the issue of race? Is that what's being asked?
Well, yeah, that's what it looks like. So I remember you talking about an answer and a question in your presentation in terms of your generation, and I guess the attendee was asking, I guess, who's asking the question.
Well, I'm asking the question, and I think a lot of people in my generation are asking the question. I remember about I don't know, maybe about going on 10 years ago now, when social media was beginning to be really big in documenting police brutality. And, there was all of this conversation around the murders of Black people by the police. I remember asking the question of why race isn't being talked about. Why is it being called police brutality? Police brutality is a result of racism. It's not something that's just this thing that stands on its own. It's a part of this entire system. And so the question that we're asking now is racism. Racism, we're calling it what it is. I've heard a major shift in the fact that we're acknowledging that patriarchy and racism and white supremacy are to blame. So then our question becomes, like I said, people in my generation, what do we do about it? We've looked to, countless amounts of our elders and our ancestors who've been fighting this work for a long time. Obviously, Afrocentricity is a big push in how we address racism and white supremacy. And so what I'm saying in terms of our political structure and the current democracy as it stands, how can we solve this issue? How can we apply these concepts of Africa, right? We mentioned Ma'at, Dr. Nehusi mentioned Ma'at. We talk about Africology and African American Studies and Afrocentricity. How can we apply these concepts to actually solve this problem for our own liberation? So that's hopefully that answers that question for you.
Well, thank you so much. Also, I see in the question section inquiries about Trump attracting that type of people who attacked the Capitol, which I think Dr. Nadav went into in depth. I'm not sure if the person asking the question had visited late. And how has Trump attracted racist white people? I think Lindsay went into that, and Dr. Nehusi just talked a lot about how this has impacted the Black community. But hold fast for the next couple of presenters, and I'm sure if that hasn't been, thoroughly, interrogated and deconstructed, then we can raise that issue again. And I appreciate the fact that everyone who I'm seeing responding said Racism, not race. That's a pet peeve of mine when people say issues of race when it's about racism. I always say if we can't even identify what we're talking about, it's going to be very difficult for us to get on the right road to solving these problems. So be careful, you know, of adopting the language of our oppressor, because oftentimes it's a distraction. And I say you can't prune a problem. We got to get to the root to get to the truth. And without further ado, we're going to move on and have another powerful graduate student at Temple University, Michael Wilson. I actually had a light prepared. I was getting a light ready like the comedians were doing. I was gonna put the light up every time y'all got close, but y'all being so good with time, I can't even use my light. So brother Michael Wilson, if you just wanna go as long as you wanna go, so I have an opportunity to put up one of my fancy lights on my phone to let you know, no, you got 15 minutes, good brother. And if you go around 2 minutes to go, I'll definitely let you know. For all those just tuning in, on behalf of the Department of Africology and African American Studies, we thank you. This recording will be available in the future. It is about the racial implications of the Washington insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. And on another note, it's about racism and white supremacy. Michael Wilson, graduate student at Temple University. You have 15 minutes, good sir.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you for the department for allowing me to present. I'm very appreciative of it. When I was thinking about what to present, there were two issues that came up for me. One issue was the constant notion that kept bringing up white supremacy and white privilege. And for some reason I had like a very complicated relationship with those terms, and I wanted to find a way to bring that out in the presentation. And also my research background is in art. So I wanted to find a way to bring that into the discussion. So in order for me to do that, I actually made a PowerPoint because I have pictures. I can't talk without showing people pictures. So I wanted to show you some pictures. And
you went on mute, good brother Michael. I don't want them to miss anything you have to say.
So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint as I talk, and hopefully we can talk about these images in the Q&A, but I want to center my presentation on these things. So let me share the screen. I think the host has to actually disable the screen share in order for me to do it, because the screen share is not disabled.
Sister Jasmine, we just want to shout out Sister Jasmine for holding it down on the technological side of things, you know, while you get that together. And she allowed you to share.
Sorry, you should be able to share now.
Got it.
All right. Thank you, Sister Jasmine.
So if I had to title this presentation, it would be If These Walls Could Talk, Visualizing White Normalcy from Trump to Biden Through Art. So why do I call this white normalcy? The Capitol riots, which led to over 100 arrests and 5 people dead, can teach us a lot about the difference between white privilege and what I'd like to call white normalcy. What I mean is that the American tradition of patriotism, it centers and revolves around whiteness. Additionally, the very definition of privilege is based in a special rights and the extension of exceptions. What we witnessed at the Capitol riot was not an argument of privileges and exceptions. They were fighting for the maintenance to be the rule. Additionally, critiquing white normalcy allows us to problematize the institution, which can be seen in various levels of acceptance of this belief and behavior, which is reflected in the response to the riot, the prosecution, and even the simple labeling of these individuals. For example, being called insurrectionists as opposed to domestic terrorists or traitors to the US. This line of interrogation, it falls in line with Dr. Ifeatu Flannery's usage of the term white misanthropy to replace the term white supremacy. Misanthropy reflects the more realistic hatred of humankind as opposed to attempting to place whiteness on a mythical pedestal of hierarchy by labeling it supreme. This notion of white normalcy is not only visible in plain sight, but it specifically can be seen on the very walls of the Capitol in the White House. If we analyze certain works of art, tracing back from Trump's inauguration through Biden's inauguration, we can see the ways in which white normalcy has been at the center of this narrative. Art tends to reflect ideology. It reflects white normalcy in multiple ways. It's shown in the juxtaposition of patriotism to whiteness. It is shown in the absence and erasure of Blackness. It's also shown in visualizing Blackness only through servitude. And finally, It shows Black servitude as a symbol for actual progress. And I will use works of art to show these as examples. So this is the first work of art. It's titled The Verdict of the People by George Caleb Bingham in 1854. What I want to do is I want to take a step back to Donald Trump's inauguration. Presidents get to choose an inaugural painting displayed during their ceremony. The painting that Trump chose was The Verdict of the People by George Caleb Bingham. This painting depicts the electorate reacting to a president's victory of the presidential victory of a pro-slavery president. The massive crowd in this painting is celebrating, while in the foreground, you see a drunkard man bent over as a symbol of intemperance, because the temperance movement was often associated with anti-slavery. You also see next to him a Black woman solemnly pushing a wheelbarrow as a symbol of slavery. This painting was also completed in 1854, which was the same time during the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act that not only established popular sovereignty, but it led to the violence of border ruffians who illegally crossed the border to terrorize abolitionists and illegally vote in the election. So the question that I'm asking is, what does it mean for Donald Trump to select this painting, The Verdict of the People, as a symbol for his inauguration? Celebrating a pro-slavery president in a turbulent years that led up to the Civil War. One thing it reflects is how enslavement was seen as the fabric of American identity, and how a symbol of celebration for Trump's presidential term in 2017. So here are the next two paintings. These two paintings are the 2018 presidential portraits of Barack and Michelle Obama that currently hang in the National Gallery. There's a lot that can be said about both of these paintings. One, they're created by Black artists, Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherrill. The background of Barack Obama's contains African blue lilies, which are reflective of his Kenyan heritage. The pattern on Michelle Obama's dress also reflects the Gee's Bend quilts. However, the point of focus are not these two paintings, but the official presidential portraits of the Obamas that are supposed to be hung in the White House. We don't know what they look like because to this day, they have not been unveiled and they do not hang in the White House. So why? Traditionally, the incoming president hosts a ceremony to unveil the hanging of the White House portraits of the previous president. It also provides an opportunity for the former first family to commingle with the current White House officials. However, Donald Trump refused to hold the ceremony for the Obamas' unveiling and to hang in the White House. Trump's refusal, I argue, is an example of another component of white normalcy, which is Black erasure. It's a symbolic statement that states not only do you not belong, but you do not exist as in Trump's America. He is not granted the permission to symbolically rest with the other presidents in the White House. This coincides with Trump's attacks questioning Obama's birth as an American citizen, but it also reflects the erasure of the Affordable Care Act and Obama's quote unquote contributions through his presidential term. So what does it mean for these portraits to not be able to exist within the White House? And I feel that these are some of the components of white normalcy. Black erasure is a consistent narrative within this discussion of what white normalcy is, yet it manifests itself in multiple ways, and this can be seen in the case of Emmanuel Jackson. The Black DC man is, so what we see here is surveillance footage of this Black DC man that captures him repeatedly striking a police officer with a baseball bat. When asked why he stormed the Capitol, Jackson responded by saying, quote, he was fighting for America. The obvious reaction among the Black community was this brother's cultural dislocation, in addition to the assumption that he would be punished harsher, and indeed, he currently still sits in jail. But that's not my focus. My focus was the white reaction, specifically by the pro-Trump community. They argued that Jackson was a BLM protester, a Black Lives Matter protester, and not with the rest of the group at the Capitol. So think about this. He is literally doing what his white counterparts are doing in that moment. However, he wasn't even given the status of being associated with them. This is what white normalcy does. As Colby Cambone states when he discusses Eurocentric worldview systems, he talks about the notion of individualism and how someone can be in a group and not be of the group. Thus, Jackson reflects the inability to belong, even though he is claiming to be there for the same causes of the other white rioters. White normalcy is also reflected in the way whiteness is juxtaposed to patriotism. So this painting is in the Capitol Rotunda, and it's a part of a series of 18-foot paintings that narrate the founding of the Republic. And this painting is titled "The Surrender of Lord Cornwallis" by John Trumbull, was created in 1826. The artist depicts the surrender of British Army in Yorktown, Virginia, which is about 3 hours from the Capitol. In the painting, mounted on horses are George Washington and General Benjamin Lincoln, as General Lincoln reaches for a British officer's sword as a symbol of defeat. What's interesting about this photo is how the rioters stare at this painting. When listening to interviews of the rioters, they describe themselves as self-identified patriots, stating, "As an American patriot, we have to do what we can to take back our country." They state that they are reclaiming 1776 as the people's protest. There is even footage of a Capitol Police officer telling one of the rioters, "I do not agree with you, but I respect it." While other officers take selfies with the rioters, and some Capitol officers are arrested for their role in assisting. This twisted acceptance and juxtaposition to patriotism, I argue, reflects how rioters feel they were reenacting the painting and deserve to be put on the same continuum as this painting's symbolism as a creation and preservation of the Republic. Well, except for poor Emmanuel Jackson. So now I'm going to jump to President Biden's inauguration. This is the inaugural painting that was presented for President Biden, which is Robert Duncanson's Landscape with Rainbows, created in 1859. This painting is interesting because it's the first inaugural painting created by a Black artist. Robert Duncanson was known for painting anti-slavery symbolism within his landscapes. This one depicts Cincinnati, Ohio, a free state at the time, directly across from Kentucky, a slave state. Landscapes are known for tranquility, while we see the rainbow as a symbol and hope for the future, Biden's America. The painting was even presented by Republican Senator Roy Blunt, who coincidentally voted against Trump's impeachment. What I argue, however, is how this painting, in relation to white normalcy, it symbolizes how Black people are often used to create the illusion of progress. The Capitol building itself is a symbol of freedom and democracy, yet it relied on enslaved labor to query, cut, and lay the sandstone that make the original Capitol building structure. This painting continues in that tradition. The rainbow is a symbol of progress, yet rainbows are optical illusions. They are reaching the end of a rainbow is a legend as opposed to a reality. Thus, the choice to use a Black artist's labor to symbolize the myth of progress is a feature that reinforces the normalcy of whiteness. There's also exists some ironic contradictions within the notion of white normalcy. So after the riots, art curators rushed to the Capitol to assess the potential damage done to the artwork in the that's in open display throughout the building. Luckily, throughout all the vandalism, none of the artwork was really damaged. There was, however, this vandalized bust of President Zachary Taylor, which appears to have blood smeared on his face. President Taylor took office in 1848. And though some scholars may consider him an anti-slavery president because he opposed the spread of slavery in the US territories during the time, he owned hundreds of slaves, managed the plantation through absentee landlord in Mississippi, and he was also said to be the last president to bring enslaved men and women to live in the White House and work. Additionally, he bought a plantation for his son in Louisiana, and when he died in 1850, he willed 131 slaves to his wife, though he did state in his will that they should be treated kindly. For this to be the only work smeared with blood brings me back to the protests of the previous summer, when protesters around the world intentionally defaced or removed problematic monuments that stood for slavery and colonialism. However, in the Capitol, Taylor, who should be a reflection of the people rioting, was ironically the only one defaced. So in closing, I leave you with this very interesting note of irony. This grainy image was taken from the cell phone of Capitol rioter and former Houston police officer Tam Din Pham, who is posing in front of a sculpture of President Gerald Ford. Pham is a former law enforcement officer, and he is reflective of the many firefighters, law enforcement officers, and members of military who were present and participated in storming the Capitol. However, there are two interesting points of irony that I want to make. First, he is standing with the statue of Gerald Ford holding Trump's flag. Gerald Ford was actually responsible for strengthening and extending civil rights and voting acts, equal opportunity and housing legislation, but also Gerald Ford had more Black people on staff in appointed leadership positions in the 1970s than Trump did currently. The second piece of irony comes in Pham's actual investigation. When Pham was investigated by the FBI, he stated that he was not present. However, after finding this image in his cell phone, Pham admitted to being present. According to federal investigators, Pham told the FBI the only reason he entered the Capitol was not to protest, but actually because he wanted to see the historical art. So in closing, what these paintings also represent is the difference between the riots that took place in the summer of 2020 and the Capitol riots of 2021. One is about racial justice, equality, and the protections of citizenship. The other was a defense of the country felt to be exclusively owned by white men who were the patriotic descendants of the Republic's forefathers. So, how do we solve this problem, as one of my colleagues brought up? Well, if we look under the guise of white normalcy, there is no problem. This is American history. The people choose to not call it so, but history says otherwise. However, it's only an issue when Black folk do it. And that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Brother Michael Wilson, for the powerful presentation. And thank you for the multimedia component. It was nice to just switch it up sometimes. If you're just tuning in on behalf of the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University, we just want to thank you for your presence here this evening, and tell a friend to tell 10. And we will have this recording available online in the near future. So fear not if you're just tuning in. You did not miss it. You will just catch it a little bit later. You know, we have a different concept of time in the African tradition. But in the interest of time, without further ado, we want to bring to you the chair of the Department of Africology and African American Studies, the man who helped to put this whole thing together. Him, that's who. And Dr. Molefi K, Asante, I don't know if I feel comfortable, you know, trying to cut you off after 15 minutes, but since you set the limits, I'm sure you'll adhere, you know, to set limits. But I did get to use my light, you know. I don't know if Brother Michael saw the light, but as an artist, you would appreciate that I selected, you know, some fine color coordination combinations for you, good brother. Without further ado, Dr. Molefi K, Asante.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. I hope you don't mind using your light on me as well. Please do. And I'm going to have to talk fast, but I just want to really say that my colleagues on this panel have done such a thorough job that one of the dangers of going last in any panel discussion is that by the time you get a chance to get your say, everything you wanted to say has been said. So I really want to say that it's really wonderful. I mean, to hear Dr. Dove, Dr. Nehusi, Michael, and Lindsay, they've just you know, done such an incredible job. And I want to thank you, Dr. Smith, for your hosting. There's nobody is you know, better than you at this. And I want to thank also Jasmine and also Belinda Wilson, who is really helping us technically. I want to start by saying that Dr. Nehusi talked about, you know, whether this was an attack or riot and so on. And I said, boy, this is our demonstration. Some of them said that they were demonstrating. But this January the 6th attack has legally been defined by people as an insurrection. and some have even called it sedition. Sedition is sort of an overt conduct, such as speech and organization, where that people use to bring about a rebellion against the authority. And of course, Dr. Dove has already explained what we understand by the word insurrection, open revolt against civil authority and so forth. So what I want to do is quickly move to some of the concepts that have been already discussed, but then to center on a particular aspect of this issue, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I really like this notion about what we saw in January the 6th was really white normalcy. I like that. And I like the notion that misanthropy is probably more of the problem than white supremacy as a term. But I like, instead of white supremacy, perhaps the doctrine of white supremacy, because there is no white supremacy. There is the doctrine of white supremacy. And for me, the uniqueness of this situation, however, when we look at this mob at the Capitol in January the 6th, the uniqueness of it is the site where it occurred. That's the uniqueness. It is not, certainly it was not un-American. I mean, mobs of white people seeking to support the doctrine of white supremacy are common instances in American history. And if you go back and examine the history of using violence and mobs to intimidate and stifle ideas that white people do not like, you will find that there have been hundreds, maybe thousands of such mob attacks on black people and other people in this country. It is part of the white American ethos, which, when confronted with difference, that they cannot control. So this has been a problem, and I just want to center this mob violence at the Capitol on one problem that I think has emerged, and I've spoken about it a bit, but I don't think I've really written it in any detail. But hearing Dr. Kimani talk a little bit about some of the other instances of mob violence gave me an idea. The Civil War, as it was called in this country, which was really quite an uncivil war, lasted between 1861 and 1865. And the question is often asked that after 500,000 people were killed, who won this war? And as we know, in the South, there were many instances after the war where actually it seemed like nothing had happened. And Dr. Nehusi also mentioned the 1898 North Carolina, the Wilmington insurrection. That insurrection occurred because African Americans had been voted into office, and some whites had been voted into office, and the whites who didn't like it, about 2,000 of them, marched into the city of Wilmington, North Carolina, and started killing people, and actually overthrew the government, the elected government. That was the first insurrection against the government in the United States. That was 1898. And so that was but before 1898, from almost the inception of the country in the 1700s and in the early 1800s, you had mob attacks on black people. In 1904, and I just want to give you some of these examples because people, when I talk to students, they've never heard of these things. And in 1904, in Springfield, Ohio, a mob of nearly 1,500 white people went into the black community, divided themselves into three groups, and drove out the black people, set their buildings on fire, and destroyed the housing for 150 people. But that was 1904. But in 1866 in Memphis, the same thing happened, but which was probably more devastating because black people coming out of the enslavement had built their homes, built their churches and schools, and all these things were attacked. And then in 1906, the Atlanta massacre of blacks happened. And this is where Du Bois says in one of his books he was frightened for his life. This is the time his son was ill. This black community was attacked by armed mobs of white people against African Americans. It lasted for 2 days. And this was one of the incidents that even went international. Le Pic Journal in Paris called it lynchings in the United States and massacre in Atlanta. And the Aberdeen, Scotland press headline, race riots in Georgia and so forth. It was a terrible time. And I'm saying all of this because I think people should have a sense of what happened. I mean, in 1908 in Illinois, there was a massacre of black people, mass racial violence where a mob of 5,000 white people, 5,000 attacked the black community in Springfield. In 1910, I mean, I'm just skipping because there were hundreds when I started looking at this, but in 1910, there was a nationwide attack on the black communities throughout the country, much like, I mean, something you've never had. This was wild. This was, you know what happened in 1910? Jack Johnson, the boxer, beat a white boxer, Jim Jeffries. And black people had to hide in their homes because so many black people were killed because white people did not like the fact that a black man had whipped a white man in the boxing match. So when we start talking about normalcy, you can see this is the mob, the white mob, gaining a sense of power and a sense of arrogance when they're in numbers like this seems to go over and over again. I mean, Malcolm said something like this about this notion of being in a group to lynch people or to massacre people, but not one-on-one, not meet a black person one-on-one, but rather in these groups. In 1910 in Slocum, Texas, there were hundreds of white people went into the black community with guns and killed as many black people as they could. This was the East St. Louis massacres were a series of massacres of black people in 1914. But the worst thing was probably the Red Summer of 1919. And the Red Summer was when, as some of you have heard me mention before, was when Mary Turner, who was the great-great-grandmother of my nieces, was killed, was lynched in Georgia, and her fetus was cut out of her belly and stomped to death. That was during what was called the Red Summer, because 1919 was one of the worst periods of outbreaks, of attacks on black people. Mobs of white people roamed the country, killing black people. Some of them went for vacations. In Elaine, Arkansas, which is probably before Tulsa, the worst and the deadliest, bloodiest racial conflict in the history of the United States, when about 2,000 to 4,000 whites descended upon a rural black town and killed up to 800 black farmers. And the reason they did it was fear of competition and fear of economic power by the black community, many of them who wanted to join a farmers union. So that was that. And then, of course, the Tulsa. 1921 was Tulsa. And, Black Wall Street, as you've heard mentioned, the single worst incident of racial violence perhaps up until that time. And then, of course, in 1923, the city of Rosewood, Florida, was wiped from the earth. That was a black town doing very well. And what happened was that white people didn't like the fact that black people had their own community and was doing quite well as farmers. And the mob of white people came in and burned down the city and killed 150 black people. So why I give you that, and because I wanted to sort of make a connection here before I finish, and I think I'm within my time. I hope so. Here's what I wanted. Why I wanted to do that, because here's what I believe, and this is really one unique aspect of this for me. I think the Civil War, and I mentioned that to you, I think the Civil War was a failure. It was a failure. The people think that it was a victory because the Union defeated the Southern Army. But actually, there was no new constitution set up. So this battle with all these people killed really did not outlaw. It did not create a constitution which said what was lawful and what was unlawful in terms of the people in the South who had fought to maintain the doctrine of white supremacy and the enslavement of Africans. Because a new constitution would have outlawed any unconstitutional organization that attacked citizens on account of race. That would have happened. But so the Civil War was neither a political revolution nor a social revolution, and it certainly was not a cultural revolution. It could have been all of these. Now, the fact that it was not a social revolution, in some aspects we can say that the politics in the South for a few years were changed, but so it may have been some political aspect to it, but it was not a social revolution. It was not a cultural revolution. The economic structures remained intact. White people who lost the war, they were paid for their losses. They were actually paid for losing the Africans who worked on their farms. We remained dispossessed. We didn't get anything, but they got paid. The government in the South was replaced, but the form of government was left in place. It meant that white people who were numerically stronger would eventually reinstitute their power. And then the third thing about this is the war did not settle cultural issues and kept in place a white racial domination system. And that white racial domination system, both in the South and in the North, really meant that they were the winning side, because it didn't eradicate the doctrine of white supremacy. It didn't outlaw economic enslavement of Africans. It did not change the symbols of the Confederacy by outlawing assaults on the American nation. And it did not make white privilege over other people a crime. And consequently, when January the 6th came around, that's why we could say that it seems normal. Because it made possible, the Civil War, the way it ended, it made possible the type of mob violence that we saw a month ago to this day. And I always say that when you look back at what happened in Nuremberg with Germany, when the Germans, when Nazism was defeated in Europe, and the international forces got together in Nuremberg, Germany, they made certain that there were certain things that had occurred during the Nazi period that would not occur afterwards. And what never happened in this country was that mob violence against black people was never considered a capital crime. And that's the mistake. And so what those people did on January the 6th was simply to try to reclaim in their spirit and in their mind to reclaim their own sense of power by actually, if I think about it, by actually demonstrating that they could keep Trump in power and probably string up Pence and Nancy Pelosi and anybody else who was standing in their way. This is the crime of America. And the Afrocentric and an Africological interpretation of this, from our standpoint, is that our vigilance is necessary, because the only way you deal with this question of racial domination is you got to abandon the concept of race itself. You have to abandon racism, and we have to keep fighting to demand that white people re-examine themselves and their own history, because these are people who are ahistorical when it comes to African people and when it comes to politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Asante. We have a few questions. Those that are addressed to someone specifically, I'll identify them as such. Otherwise, I'm assuming that they could be answered by whoever chooses to answer. I see Sarah says, is the discourse of democracy in the United States not in some ways tainted by racism from the start? What does it take for African Americans and indigenous natives to these lands to avoid signaling with codes imposed on us by white supremacy? Anybody choose to field that question? Or I can repeat it.
Well, I did. Yeah. I thought Dr. Dove would answer that question. So read it one more time.
Yeah, you're on mute, Dr. Dove. You would choose to answer, but I'll read it again. Sarah says, is the discourse of democracy in the United States not in some ways tainted by racism from the start? What does it take for African Americans and indigenous natives to these lands to avoid signaling with codes imposed on us by white supremacy?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I personally, as an Africologist, do not think democracy exists in this country, because I use the ancient African beliefs to set my standards of what democracy would be. And certainly the whole construct of this country is based upon the blood of the indigenous people and the African people that were brought here and enslaved. So democracy is cancelled by that very fact and that very reality. So I think you're saying that it would be important for First Nations people and African people to come together to discuss terms of engagement with each other and work out ways in which to have strength with each other, create forces together, institutions together that would really be suitable, affirming, culturally grounded in the values and beliefs of First Nations people and African people, which are very, very similar because for many reasons, which so, you know, I think that discussion has to take place, and how it could take place is through our making links with First Nations people. And I think one way that that can happen in a tangible way is through the Center for Anti-Racism Research that's going to be coming out of our department and opening, where we would try to engage First Nations people in the dialogue that comes out of that work and in the research and be part of that. I would think that that was possible, and that might be the place that it could, where this union could start, because everything has to have a beginning, and usually it has to be basic, you know, because I don't know that the government's going to do something like that, but I think we as a department can reach out in those areas. And I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my answer.
Well, I definitely appreciated the answer and the way that you were able to plug the Anti-Racist Center coming to Temple University. That was like an AI crossover. No Patrick Ewing tipping the ball, not making it in, if you remember 92. Okay, but that was just beautiful. And stay, engaged with a lot of the, the productive institutional changes that we will be making in the near future to engage such topics from an Africological perspective. I see that Olivia discusses the intersection of gender and race when she asks, does the panel believe that Capitol insurrection was a direct result of white Americans' growing desperation to regain their patriarchal control over the nation as they realize the political climate in the United States has begun to shift its primary focus on predominantly white issues and orient toward rights for melanated peoples and gender equality?
I think if I could, I'll just simply say I agree with that question. Yes, that's the reason. I mean, I think it's a demographic issue. I mean, what you have now is a country that the majority of the people, if not immediately, certainly in 4 or 5 years, the majority of the people in this country will be other than white. So you have a interesting phenomena. And you have people, of course, trying to figure out how to shore up this doctrine of white supremacy. And I think that Lindsay Gary mentioned earlier this whole question about gaps in democracy. And I think that relates to what Dr. Dove was just saying, that we may need to re-examine this whole question of how do you create a compact with people who occupy the same land. And it's a very, very profound question, but we can interrogate that because we do have a long history. And but that's the way I feel. I think that Olivia's question is correct.
We have a question directed to Michael Wilson. Says, Mr. Wilson from Philip, do you have any ideas as to why no paintings were damaged or destroyed? I was surprised that no art was destroyed, and I do not think many of them understood the significance of the paintings. So do you have any ideas as to why no paintings were destroyed or damaged during the insurrection?
I think they did understand what the paintings were. They may not have been able to give some type of art historical reading, but I think they understood exactly what they meant. The reason why I say that is because there's footage inside the chambers of rioters looking for information, and you see the person with the zip tie running around, but you hear one of them saying, this is a sacred place. This is a sacred place. As you know, the dude dressed up like a Viking was around doing what he was doing. And for the fact that they make the statements that they're making, this is a sacred space. We are patriots doing our patriotic duty. This is 1776. What they're doing is whether it's intentional or not, they're juxtaposing themselves to those paintings, because that's exactly what those 18 paintings are doing. They are talking about the formation of the Republic as patriots. And what those people were doing on January 6th is in their mind fits on a continuum of what that represents. This is our country, and we have a right to take it back. We have a right to rise up against the government if it's tyrannical. You know, like that's a rhetoric you constantly heard throughout Donald Trump's presidency. So when you look at those, when someone looks at those paintings, whether they can read them or not, they see themselves, and they see their fathers and their uncles and their grandfathers, and they see themselves as honoring that space as being sacred by taking it over from the terrorists such as a Mike Pence or an AOC, right? Or a Nancy Pelosi, which I think also plays into something else as whiteness being like this kind of fraternity where you could kick people out, because Mike Pence wasn't white when that was going on, because they were looking at him as the enemy, you know? So I really think that they knew, whether they can tell who that person was in it or not, they knew what the intention of that painting's existence was, and they were acting it out in their ignorance. They knew fully what it was.
It's interesting. There was a question that I think you actually answered. That was, is it possible to make the case that those who were involved in the insurrection, the white supremacists, on the Capitol use their love for America as a scapegoat mechanism. But I think we've answered that one, so you guys were on the same page at the same time. So you answered two questions at once, Brother Michael. So thank you for that. We have another question about the historical patterns. But before I mentioned that, I really just wanted to make a note of how people talk so often about how long ago, some of these events in history were, although we know that, like Dr. Asante always says, we got to use chronology and have proper historical chronology, that it wasn't long ago, figuratively or empirically. How fast people resorted back to solving political problems and disagreements through extrajudicial murder and called for a lynching. The same people who act like it's such a distant memory and so separate from their foundational consciousness, the second they got mad, they were ready to do it to the vice president and call for it publicly. So I think that was one thing that was very interesting. And also the contradiction of the sacred space that we have just defaced, I think is emblematic of the overall hypocrisy and contradiction of the white normalcy, or as Dr. Mazam will say, is Western decadence. So for the last question, George Dan says, given the historical pattern of white racist group violence against Black people, what should be the response of Black people if such happens today? That is a question to end on. I'll let a few people answer that one. What should be our response today, given the historical pattern of white racist groups enacting violence against Black people?
Well, I think that if I may, if I look at our history, one of the things when I was looking at these mob attacks of white people in Black communities, what happened over the years, over the decades, as mobs would go into Black communities and attack Black communities, then you began to have in the early part of the 20th century until the latter part of the 20th century, you began to have Black people defending themselves. Black people picking up, and it starts with the Tulsa thing, because in Tulsa, the Black people also picked up guns, and they said, okay, we'll fight. Of course, they were outmanned and outplaned. A plane dropped a bomb, on the city. But you have Black people just becoming stronger and stronger in terms of resistance until a period changed where it was not mobs coming into Black communities. Mobs stopped coming into Black communities, but they put the police into the Black communities. And then you have the demonstrations of Black people, which sometimes went into violence against property and that kind of thing, but never any instance where Black people, as a mob of Black people, went into a white community and just killed white people because, we're going to exterminate these people. No, that is never in our imagination. That's not an African way of responding to it. But I think that is certainly, what I've seen is that Black people are saying, we will defend ourselves.
Would anybody else like to answer before we close?
Yes, I would like to make a contribution here. In addition to what Dr. Asante said, I think we should do things like what we're doing here. Try to understand what is happening around us, why it is happening, and see patterns in our history. And I think we've said enough already to establish that the mob violence, the insurrection, the treacherous attack on American democracy at the Capitol is part of a history of white people using violence to enforce their views. And that one important part of that view is the exclusion of other people of color, including African Americans, from participating in what they consider as democracy, the nation, truth, and so on. Those things exist only for white people, and especially for white men, but not for other people. And we've got to be clear that when America has defined itself as democratic and as truth-loving and so on, it did not mean people who've been othered and oppressed. Indigenous Americans, African Americans, women in particular, but not only. And it is for us who inhabit intellectual spaces to begin to understand these things and to propagate our understanding of them. This is not the only action we should take, but we should be very, very active in promoting our interpretation and understanding of these events. It's very, very important that we see taking back our history, taking back our
interpretations, analysis. Yeah.
Interpretations, analysis, but agency, your word, Dr. Asante.
That's right.
Our agency, you know, we've got to insist on having our agency. So we go out into our communities, we go out into other communities, we go out in cyberspace, and we propagate our understanding. Because a very important aspect of white misanthropy, of the doctrine of white supremacy, has been its ability to propagate its ideas and to stifle other ideas coming out of our communities. And this is part of what I mean when I say reparations. We've got to repair ourselves. We've got to restore our capacity to tell truth from our vantage point and to shine light on America. Let us not forget that we are in an especially privileged position, though it may not seem so to all of us every time, but we're in a very good position to pronounce upon truth and justice and so on. And this is not only because of the fact that we've been treated the most unjustly, that so many lies have been told about us that we've got to take back our history, but it is also because we have a responsibility to humanity as the first humans, the creator of humanity, and we must never forget that.
Thank you, Dr. Nehusi. And I want to take the last few minutes just to give Dr. Dove, Michael Wilson, and Lindsay just a minute to give any closing remarks. I know you might not, have an answer for that question in particular, but I think it'd be good, and I'm sure that the participants would benefit just hearing any closing remarks from the three of you. I mean, Dr. Nehusi and Dr. Asante as well, but I think it's
I'm good.
Time I'd like to just give at least a minute to each of the other participants to give some reflection and closing thoughts. We can start with Dr. Dove. I'm going.
Well, I agree with Dr. Nehusi in the sense that it's important for us to have more of these. So thank you, Dr. Asante, for inventing the idea, creating the idea and giving us the space, because I agree that the more that we have this discussion, and it's all about education, which to me is the bottom line, because it's the only way that anybody can change from being anything to become something. And, this type of webinar discourse gives us the opportunity to learn and grow from each other, to share ideas. And, this is the only non-racist discipline in the whole university where we can actually be true and discover truth and become who we can become. It's the only place. And, we're all blessed again to be here, because it's here that we can have true discussions, and as seekers of truth, we can continue that work and share what we have and anything that we hear to, add to it and learn and grow from it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Lindsay?
Yes, thank you again for allowing me to share. It was such an honor to be sharing amidst you all. I would definitely encourage all of us, again, to continue having these conversations, but also engaging in our Afrocentric consciousness. I think that's really important in understanding and being able to apply that to the things that are going on in the world, so that we're not surprised when something like what happened on January 6th happened. I think that Afrocentricity enables us to be prepared on how to handle these situations. I know someone was asking about what we do, and I would say, how can we use Afrocentricity to do that? You know, we do need to be defending ourselves. We do need to have these conversations. And we do have to understand that if it happened just a month ago, it can happen again, and it can happen in so many different ways. And so we cannot be afraid to employ that, and we can't be afraid to do what's best for our communities, you know, whatever that may look like, depending on the circumstances. And so I want us to continue to be proactive and not reactive to the things that are happening in the world.
Thank you so much. And also, Brother Michael, you're on mute, brother. We don't want to miss it. There you go.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone. It was great to be able to just share ideas together, especially because we're so apart with what's going on. So I'm really appreciative. And, you know, I think that, you know, everything that I would say is just lock in step with what everyone else said. I just think it's important to be culturally grounded because as, you know, people of color become the majority, you're going to have less and less white people to blame stuff on. So the question is going to be about location. You know, it's really going to be about, you know, location and your cultural grounding and how that informs your decisions. And so I think cultural grounding is important. And also, I think it's important to create whatever it is. You know, I like art, but, you know, all of you create things. So with that cultural grounding, you have to create because those are going to be our archives. You know, Fahamu Peko is one of my favorite artists, and he says history will tell you what happened, but art is going to tell you how it felt. And I really think that it's important that we create these types of archives. So when we look back, we can question it like, no, that's not actually how it went down and what it meant. So I think that we really have an important task at hand.
And I thank you all. And I think on that note, it is definitely a blessing that for the annals of history, somebody asked where they'll be able to see this recording. So if you want to share that, Sister Belinda, when I pass it over to you in a moment, you could definitely let the people know where that will be. Thank you to Sister Jasmine, the event administrator, who made sure this all went so smoothly. Thank you so much to everybody involved in the planning. Thank you to Dr. Asante and all of the panelists. Thank you for attending. This has been Racial Implications of the Washington Insurrection from the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. And be on the lookout for more events coming out of the department. And as was stated earlier, the Center for Anti-Racism will be at Temple University, and you can look forward to a lot of productive conversations and plans and actions around issues such as this and how to avoid, you know, being surprised. I like what Sister Lindsay said, because the one thing you shouldn't be by now is surprised. With that being said, thank you. It's been an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure just to serve you this evening in this capacity. And Ms. Belinda Wilson, if there's any closing commentary or things that they need to take note of, I will ask if you would like to share that with the panelists and participants at this time. And if not, in the tradition of Def Comedy Jam, when he just bids everybody a good night, right? Take care and keep making the ancestors proud and keep struggling and keep working and keep advancing Afrocentric consciousness and just involve yourself in your culture and the conversation around progress for African people throughout the world. Take care. Thank you.
And thank you very much, moderator. You did an excellent job. And the recording will be on our website. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Good night.